But I am excited to dive in, or actually wrap up, the series that you've been in for the past couple weeks called Dealing with Doubt. And in this series, you've kind of been talking about how do we handle doubt. So we all struggle with doubt. We all have questions about God. We all have doubts about God. Maybe it's something about who he is, or maybe it's something about what he's telling us to do. And sometimes we wrestle with doubts. And that's not a bad thing, as we'll talk about here in a minute. And so as you've been going through this series, you've been talking about, okay, how do we handle that kind of doubt when it comes into our lives? And so I want to wrap up that series tonight by giving you another way that you can deal with the doubt in your life. But before I do that, let me give you 3 reminders. And I know these are probably already been said in this series, but it's worth repeating because they're very, very important. And the first one is this: doubt is not bad. All right? Doubt is not bad. For some reason in the Christian world, a lot of us believe that if you doubt, it equals bad. Like you're a bad Christian, or you're a bad person, or God doesn't love you if you have questions. And that's just not true. Every single one of you in this room, you either have doubts right now about God, or you will have doubts in the future, right? I promise you that. Because that's part of us being humans. We wrestle, we have questions, we don't fully understand God, and so we doubt him at times. So doubt isn't bad. And that's why I love that Alan is doing this series with you guys, is because I want you to know, even as a middle schooler, that you wrestle with doubt, and that's okay, and that's not bad, all right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is Christians struggle with doubts. So if you're a Christian and you struggle with doubts, you might think, am I really a Christian because I'm struggling with doubts? Like, I have all these questions. Am I really a child of God? Or you might think you're like a terrible Christian because you have doubts, and that just isn't true. Right? The most famous Christians in the Bible and all throughout church history have been people who wrestled with doubts. All right? It is a very normal thing in the Christian life. And I would even argue that if you don't wrestle with doubts and you have no questions and no doubts, that's probably a good indication you're not actually a Christian, right? Because why would you wrestle with those things if you didn't really care about God and didn't really want to follow him with your life? And so many times doubt is an indication that there is faith. There is something there in your life. So it's not a bad thing, and Christians struggle with it. And here's the last thing. Doubts help us grow. And I hope you've seen this over the past 2 weeks, that as you wrestle with your doubts, you tend to grow in your faith, right? You don't grow in your faith when you have all the answers. You just don't. But if you wrestle with questions and doubts about God, that typically turns into growth in your life. And that is why I believe all of us at some point in our Christian life will wrestle with some very serious doubts, because God wants to help us grow. So I want you to know those out of the gates, all right? You've probably heard some of that already, but it's worth being reminded of as we dive into this last one tonight. And so before I give you what the last kind of thing to do to deal with your doubt is, I want to give you a little insight into my own life. Because I want you to know that I am not speaking to you just as someone that's like, hey, here's doubts, and this is what you should do, and you should figure it out. I'm speaking to you as someone who has my own doubts. That even as a pastor, even as someone that's been a Christian since I was a middle schooler, I've wrestled at times in my Christian life, even up to presently, with certain doubts in my life and certain questions. And all of us do. I said that earlier. Your doubts are different than mine, but I am like you. I'm right there with you. I'm trying to figure out what it looks like to follow God. What does it look like to follow this Jesus that gave his life for us? And I don't have it all figured out. And I still have questions, and I still wrestle with doubt. And to be really honest with you, I'll give you a little insight into what that looks like in my own life. So one of the things I really struggle with at times is I doubt God's love for me. All right? And as a pastor, I stand up in front of people all the time and say, God loves you. But I don't always believe that about myself. And some of that comes from my upbringing, that I didn't have a dad growing up, and I was living in a home that no one really expressed love. So I rarely heard people say, I love you, even my parents. And so because of that, I take that into my walk with God. And even though I know God loves me and he says that, and I know it here, I don't always feel it here. And that causes me to doubt sometimes, does God really love me? Right? Like, I know he loves other people, but does he really love me? And that bleeds into sometimes when I read God's promises in his word about my salvation in him and having this relationship with him through Jesus, sometimes I doubt that. Like, do I really understand it? Do I really get this, all right? And so I want you to know, if you're thinking, well, Austin, you're a terrible pastor because you struggle with doubts, that's fine, right? You're probably true. I am probably a terrible pastor because of that. And that's okay, all right? Because we all struggle with doubts, and I am perfectly okay struggling with mine, and I hope you do as well. So that's a little bit of who I am, a little bit of my story. And so I want to wrap up the series tonight by giving you one more way to deal with your doubt, and that is through taking risk. All right, one of the ways that you can handle doubt in your life is by taking a risk. So 2 weeks ago, you talked about dealing with doubt through what? Experience, right? I think that was Alan. Okay, all right, experience. And I think you guys had like a big brick swinging back and forth or something. So you talked about dealing with doubt through experience. Last week, you talked about dealing with doubt through testing. Good job, all right? So tonight, we're going to end by talking about dealing with doubt through risk. And what I want to do that is I want to show you a place in the Bible where one of Jesus' disciples had to take a risk. And after we look at that story, we'll take a step back and figure out how does that apply to our lives right now as people who have doubts and need to take a risk. So it's going to be on the screen as we look at this passage. We're going to look at it in a couple of sections. And it starts in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, and it says this. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. All right? So let me stop there for a minute, and you can leave that last one up there. Yeah, that one right there. Leave that up there just for a minute. So what's happening here is Jesus tells his disciples, he says, hey, get in this boat, go across this sea, and I'll meet you on the other side. And this sea that he's referring to is the Sea of Galilee. So he says, hey, get in this boat, go across the Sea of Galilee, I'll meet up with you later. So the disciples go out on this boat, and it says when they get into the middle of the sea, this storm came. So the winds start to come, the waves are crashing, and they're in this boat. And these aren't like massive boats like we have today. We're thinking like, oh, it's a storm, you're fine. Like these were little wooden boats that if a storm came, you probably were going to die. So they're in the middle of this sea, the storm is coming, the winds are raging, and they're freaking out. And then on top of that, they see this image walking at them, right? And it said it was in the fourth watch, so that's like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So it's kind of early in the morning, still in the middle of the dark. They see this image walking towards them, and now they're thinking, not only is there a storm, now there's this ghost that's going to kill me, right? Like that person with the mask that walked in. That guy or girl, I don't know, maybe, whatever. So, yeah, so that person walked in, right? And I'm like, they are going to kill me, and they still might. So that's kind of what they felt like. And so the disciples are freaking out, right? Like they're thinking, what's going on? And so they see this thing walking towards them, and they think it's a ghost. But let's see what happens next. And you can go to the next slide, and I'll read it. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come on the water. He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So they think it's a ghost, but it turns out it's Jesus. And the moment they know it's Jesus is when he speaks and says, "Hey, it is I." They recognize his voice. And so they realize it's not a ghost, and it says Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples, he was excited, right? Maybe he was excited because he was about to die in this storm, and he notices Jesus is coming, and he's thinking, get me out of the storm. Jesus, I want to be close to you. Or maybe he was just pumped to see his friend, and he wanted to jump out of the boat and go walk to him. Now, Peter knew that he couldn't walk on water, right? Like Peter's like us. If we're in a boat, we don't automatically think, hey, I'm going to get out and walk on the water. None of us do that. Why? Because it's humanly impossible. And Peter knew that. And that's why Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come onto the water." Right? He knew that he couldn't walk on water, but if Jesus said, "Hey, Peter, come out of the boat and walk on the water," he could do it. Why? Because God could give him the power. God could give him the ability to do it. So he says, "Jesus, I want to walk on water. I can't do it on my own, but I know you can help me, so call me out." And Jesus says, "All right, come out on the water." And Peter takes a step, and he begins to walk on the water to Jesus. So think about this for a minute before we read the rest of the story. So we're talking in this series about dealing with doubt. And so I am sure there is a lot of doubt going on right now in the mind and heart of Peter. So he's in the middle of the boat, in the middle of a storm. So I'm sure he's probably doubting, is he going to live? right? He's probably thinking, am I going to die tonight in this boat? Am I going to make it out of the storm? Then he sees this image walking towards him, and he thinks it's a ghost. Now he starts doubting, what the heck is that? So he's probably got doubts, questions, fears, everything going off in his head. Now he realizes it's Jesus, and that takes away the ghost fear. But now he's thinking, all right, I want to walk on the water. And Jesus says, all right, Peter, come on out. And in that moment, I am sure a ton of doubts flooded into his mind. You know, he's probably thinking, is Jesus really going to be able to give me the power to walk on water? Is this really going to happen? Like, what if I think this is Jesus and it's not? What if I start to sink? What am I going to do? He probably had tons of doubts and tons of questions. But what did Jesus do? Jesus just said, come. Jesus didn't give him a bunch of things like, well, try this and then try that. Or Peter, think back to your past experiences. He hasn't walked on water before. He has no experience to rely on. Jesus just says, Peter, come out of the boat. And so Peter had to make a decision. He is in the boat. The only thing there is him, his doubts, and Jesus. And he has to make a decision. Am I going to believe this Jesus? Am I going to have faith in this Jesus and take the risk of stepping out of this boat? The risk that I could drown, the risk that I could, get out of the water or step on the water and everything goes great. He doesn't know what's going to happen. All he had was his own doubts and Jesus saying, hey, come out of the boat. And he had to take the step. He had to take the risk. And he did. And it says he began to walk on the water to Jesus. But the story doesn't end there. This is what it says next. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why do you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. So Peter gets out of the boat. He takes the risk. He expresses his faith in Jesus. He says, I believe you. I'm going to take that risk. He steps out. He walks on the water. But it says once he starts walking, he then started to sink. And you might be thinking, why? Why did he start to sink? Why did he start to walk on the water, but then he started to sink? And you might have caught it in that passage. It says he took his eyes off of Jesus and started looking at everything else around him. He started looking at the wind and the waves, and he started looking at the storm instead of looking at Jesus, the one that could actually give him the ability to walk on the water. And the moment he took his eyes off Jesus, he started to sink. Now, this is what I want you to catch from that. All right, I don't want you to catch necessarily that he started to sink, because that's not the point. What I want you to catch is when he started to sink, what did Jesus do? Jesus didn't yell at him. Jesus didn't say, well, that sucks, Peter. Sorry. See you later. Bye. Right? He didn't do that. He didn't say, like, Peter, you idiot, stop doubting me, right? Like, he kind of gives this little rebuke, like, oh, little faith, but that's not a sharp rebuke. What did he do? Jesus put his hand down and pulled Peter out of the water and got in the boat with him, right? He had doubts. He took a risk, and even after he took the risk, he probably started to have some doubts again when he started to sink. But what did Jesus do? Jesus says, Peter, it's okay. I am with you. Let me help you. I know you have questions. I know you have doubts. This isn't going to be the last time you question me and doubt me. I get that. So Jesus steps into the storm with him and says, let me help you through this. And so that's what Peter went through. Now let's talk a little bit about us. Because you might be thinking, cool, that's good for Peter. Like, I'm not planning on walking on water anytime soon, so what should I do with this? And there's a couple of things I want you to get out of it. There's 3 simple applications, and if you're taking notes on your cards, these are some blanks you can fill out. So a couple of applications. Number 1 is this. We all struggle with doubts about God, right? And I said this earlier, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I want to repeat it because it is so important that we all struggle with doubts. Not some of us, all of us. And if you tell me you don't, that probably means that you will in the future and you just haven't yet, because I'm sure at some point you will. And Peter, one of the greatest disciples of Jesus, like Peter would go on to be one of the people that started the church. Like he preached the first sermon and tons of people came to faith and he just became the center of the church, right? So this was a very, very, very famous disciple of Jesus. And he wrestled with doubts. He wrestled with questions. Right? Some of the greatest Christians that ever lived were people who struggled with doubt the most. And so I want you to know that. If there's anything you remember from this story, remember that Peter struggled with doubts. So that's probably going to mean you're going to struggle with doubts. And that's okay, because Peter turned out pretty darn fine, all right? You're going to be good. So that's the first thing. Second thing is this. Sometimes in the face of doubt, all we can do is take a risk and express our faith. Right? So in this series, you've talked about dealing with doubt through experience and testing, and all of that's great. And I think those are some of the best ways to handle doubt. Like if you have doubt in your life, look at your experiences. Look at what God has done in your life. Look at what God has done in other people's lives, right? See experience and allow that to build your faith. That's great. Through testing. Sometimes you're in a situation where you can test, and God says, hey, I want to prove to you I'm faithful, and he will do that. But sometimes you're in a situation like Peter. You don't have experience. You don't have testing. All you have is Jesus, yourself, and your doubts. And you have to make that step and say, you know what? I'm going to take the risk. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what God's going to do. I'm terrified. I'm afraid. But so be it. I want to take that risk. And that is sometimes what you got to do in the face of doubt. And so let me give you a quick story to illustrate this, all right? So there's a picture I think you can throw up there. It's not a great picture, but this is all I got. So when I was back in college, I interned at a church. And one of the things that we did with our high schoolers is we took a trip to Canada. And we went up to kind of like the Montreal River, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, Canada. And we go up there, and I remember we got on this boat to go out to this camp, and they were like, hey, if you get hurt, like a helicopter comes, and it's like 2 hours to the closest hospital. So don't get hurt, all right? I'm like, oh, that's cool. So we're out in the middle of nowhere, and we take this boat. We camped out a few nights, and then we took a boat up the river to all these waterfalls. And as we were going up, these kind of like trip guys that knew the area, they knew all about the waterfalls and the things we were going to do. They said, hey, we're going to get up to these waterfalls, and we're going to do jumping off some cliffs. We're going to go cliff jumping. And I remember we get up to this one cliff, and there's a picture of it there. And I remember thinking in the boat, like, it doesn't look that high. Like, I'm sure it's like, it's not like low, but it's not high, whatever. So everyone's like pumped up, and I'm one of the leaders on the trip, so I'm like, yeah, I'll lead the way, like, follow me, high schoolers. So we go up to the top, and I remember when I got up there, I was like, holy cow, like, this looks 10 times higher than it was from the boat. And so I'm standing on the edge, and all the students are behind me like, go, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I'm crapping and peeing my pants right now. I'm so afraid. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't back out, right? Like I couldn't say, no, I was going to like a loser, right? I had to do it. And the only thing I had to go with was the guys that took us up there. They were like, hey, we're going to check the water to make sure it's deep enough. Because sometimes if it hasn't rained enough, it's not deep enough, and you can like hit the rocks. And again, like you're 3 hours away, so you might live, might die, who knows. So they jump in the water, they go swimming down, and they're like, hey, you're good, man. It's deep enough. We're good. So I'm like, cool. I met you like 2 days ago. I have no clue who you are, but I'll trust you. So I'm standing on this cliff, and all I had going for me was these guys that told me I'm going to be okay, and me, right? There's no one jumped before me. I had no like testing in my background. Like, how do I test jumping off a cliff? I had no clue. The only thing I had was to trust these dudes that told me it was going to be okay. And so what did I do? I had to take a risk, all right? And obviously, I'm here tonight, so it turned out fine. But I had to take a risk of saying, you know what? I trust you. I know you know what you're talking about. Thanks for checking the water, and I'm going to go for it. And I had to take that leap. And so you can take that off because I don't really care to look at myself anymore. But so much of the Christian life is just like that, right? So much of your Christian life as you follow Jesus is going to be like that you're not going to have a lot to see. That God's going to say, hey, do this, believe this about me, and take a risk. And so much of your life as a Christian is going to be taking those risks. That you're going to say, you know what, Jesus, I believe what you say, I believe what you've done, and I don't care if I don't see the whole picture or I don't see what's below this cliff. I'm going to take the leap because I trust you, all right? And there's a great quote from Martin Luther King Jr., and it's on the screen, I believe. He says this: faith is taking the first step when you don't see the whole staircase. You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. And so I want to challenge you tonight. I am sure that there is a doubt that you have, something holding you back, a fear, a question you have about God. Maybe it's something about him or something he's done. Maybe it's something he's telling you to do, and you're waiting for him to give you like more. You're like, well, God, I will do this when, or I'll do this if you do this. And Jesus is like, nah, man, like just take the leap, take the first step. And so sometimes all you're going to see is the next step, and you have to take that risk. So let me give you one more thing, and then we're done. When it comes to this story about Peter, remember this. Jesus is there to help you in this whole process. Jesus is going to be there to help you. If you have doubts, if you have questions, I promise you, if you take a risk, if you take that step of faith, Jesus is not going to leave you hanging. He is going to be right there with you, holding your hand, saying, hey, son, daughter, I got you. I love you. I want to help you. And he is going to walk with you through every single doubt that you have in your entire life. I promise you that. And so with that in mind, let me give you 3 words to end. And I know Alan's kind of been doing this, so let me remind you of these 3 words. They're going to be up on the screen. Doubt, risk, belief. Doubt, risk, belief. And that order is important. That all of us in this room have doubts. We have to take a risk at times. And what's on the other side of that risk is belief. That we believe in God more, that we believe in Jesus more, that we believe what it means to follow him more. But a lot of you are wanting that belief. You want to believe and you want to have faith and you want to follow God, and maybe what's holding you back is the risk. That you got to take that step. You got to step forward and say, you know what, I believe you, Jesus, I'm going to take it. So whatever you're doubting in this series, whatever's came up in your mind, understand you may just have to take a risk. And I hope you do that. And so with that in mind, let me pray real quick, and then you guys are going to break up into groups of 8, I believe, for your discussion group. So let me pray real quick. Jesus, I thank you for being a God who loves us, who helps us in our doubts. God, I pray all of us in this room, myself included, would be 100% honest with you and other people in our lives that love us like these leaders, and we would express our doubts and be okay with that. But God, we would not stay there, that we would move from our doubts and take a risk and have faith and belief in you. And I pray as we do that, you would grow our faith. So God, please help us to do that, even in this time as we discuss. Help us to be honest. In Jesus' name, amen.